if you're anything like me, you've looked up from a long session of trawling through meeting agendas and technical standards and realized, with a flash of panic, that your legislators are making decisions without nearly enough data. And then you go down a wormhole of trying to fact check everything else they've ever said. But in case you're not, here's a quick summary of a bill in South Dakota that's been occupying my mind for the last 2 months. Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm a senior studying civil engineering at the Cooper Union, and I interned for the last 2 summers in South Dakota at the Department of Agriculture. So when I saw an article telling me about proposed changes to green building requirements for South Dakota buildings, I knew I had to talk about it. Here's a rundown of the state's existing green building laws. If the state of South Dakota is building something, like a dorm building for one of the public universities, or renovating something, like one of the veterans' retirement homes, as long as it's a certain size, it has to meet certain standards, what we call a high-performance green building standard. It is possible to get a waiver for these standards from the Office of the State Engineer if it meets any of the following criteria. It's a building that won't be occupied most of the time, like a warehouse for maintenance vehicles. It would cost more to meet those green building standards than would be saved in energy and water efficiencies. Meeting the green building standard would interfere with a building's historic preservation status, if it's a renovation for less than half the square footage of the building, or if there are extenuating circumstances as decided by the state engineer. Let's talk about what I mean by green building. LEED is short for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a rating system put out by the U.S. Green Building Council designed to improve energy efficiency, reduce environmental impact, and improve the quality of life for anyone in a building. A quick note, I'll often say a building is certified LEED to mean it meets USGB standards and has received certification. In daily life, I might also say that a person is certified LEED to mean that the USGBC has verified through a standardized test that they are an expert in implementing LEED methods. But it gets a little confusing to keep saying certified, so I'm going to say that a person or a company is LEED qualified to mean the same thing. Taking a look at LEED version 4.1, which was last updated in February of this year, you can see there are a few different categories. To get an idea of what certifying a building entails and to set up the story in South Dakota, I'll explain 3 different practices that can get you points towards certification. I've had to refilm this part a couple of times because of technical difficulties, so I hope you'll forgive the casual button-up black shirt. The practices, though, first is bicycle facilities. You have to provide short-term bike storage, a bike rack, long-term bike storage, an indoor bike room of some kind, and at least one shower room. Exactly how much of each depends on the expected occupancy of the building. And then the building itself needs to be within walking or biking distance of a transit stop, a school or employment center if the project is residential, or from a variety of businesses and services, which just means downtown or essential business district of some kind. Second, indoor water use reduction. Install water fixtures like faucets and toilets that require less water per use. If you've ever used a toilet with like the 2 levels of flush, that's what we're talking about here. And finally, thermal comfort. Install HVAC systems according to a thermal comfort condition standard and provide thermal controls, thermostats, in a certain number of occupied spaces in the building. Each of those practices is worth a certain number of points. A building can achieve certified, silver, gold, or platinum, depending on how many points it gets. So now that we understand what the law currently says and the basics of LEED, let's take a look at what changes South Dakota Senate Bill 134 proposes. First, the definition of the green building standard has been changed from silver to just certified. The bill also proposes removing the requirements for renovations entirely. In the original version of the bill, new construction just had to attempt to achieve the highest rating reasonably obtainable in accordance with the high-performance green building standard. The most recent version, which, spoiler alert, was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, clarifies, new construction shall, in good faith, be designed with the intention of meeting or exceeding the high-performance green building standard that was in effect when the construction was registered with a rating system. Before construction begins, the Office of the State Engineer, Architect, and Building Owner shall identify, in good faith, all components of the new construction that are used to satisfy the requirements of this section. The bill has gone through a couple amendments based on feedback from contractors, architects, and other stakeholders. I want to note that this bill moved fast and hadn't been shown to a lot of those stakeholders before it was presented, leading to major amendments and general dissatisfaction from the opposition. As far as removing requirements for renovations, the motivation for this was that the vast majority of the waivers granted for state building projects were renovations. There are issues with building envelopes, which is the barrier in a building between conditioned space and non-conditioned space, which has an impact on how easy and cheap it is to keep the inside heated or cooled, and with historic facades, which can make it prohibitively expensive to retrofit enough to achieve LEED certification. But a lot of the renovation projects aren't in historic buildings. A lot of them are just for nondescript dorm buildings that were built in the 90s. And when it comes to the good faith clause, Justin Bell, lobbyist for the Design Professional Coalition in South Dakota, and other opponents pointed out that in good faith doesn't have the specific legal definition and can vary in interpretation from court to court. And it says new construction must be designed with the intention of meeting or exceeding the standards. And it does imply that the project must be registered with a certification system, which is the first step to actually be certified. But as Bell notes, none of that means that any building has to follow through on that. If a component of the construction ends up being unavailable, since the construction doesn't actually have to be certified, there's no requirement to seek out a viable alternative. Of course, if everyone is truly acting in good faith, and if we all have the same definition of what that good faith entails, then there won't be a problem. But that second point, about having the same definition of good faith, is where I predict this bill and any similar ones will run into trouble. Another argument brought up by the proponents of the bill, specifically the representative from the Association of General Contractors, is that there are very few in-state contractors who are willing to work on projects that need to be LEED certified, since it's not something you're familiar with. And since there are so few willing contractors, the cost of construction rises, whether due to markups by in-state contractors or costs incurred by bringing in an out-of-state contractor. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about the construction contracting process. Most construction projects undertaken by public entities like governments and schools are what we call design, bid, build. So the customer, let's say Dakota State University, realizes that they have a problem. They want to build a new engineering building, so they decide details like how large they want it to be, what types of amenities, whether it's LEED certified, the general aesthetic to match the rest of campus, other things along those lines. Then they hire a design engineer or an architect, someone who will actually draw up the plans and do all the calculations. Sometimes the design engineer or architect is directly hired. Sometimes Dakota State University will put out a request for a proposal, which I'll explain in a second. So that was the design phase. Now for the bid phase. Dakota State University will put out a request for a proposal, or RFP, that says, hey, we have this 300,000 square foot engineering building project, who wants to build it? Construction general contractors see this RFP and put together their proposal, which says things like, we're experts in building classroom buildings. Here are projects we've worked on in the past. Look how good they look, and here's exactly the kind of work we'll do for you, and this is how much money we want. So then Dakota State University has to look at all of these bids and decide which one they want to work with. Contracts usually go to the lowest qualified bidder, the contractor who has a successful track record of building classroom buildings, and costs less than the next bid. Sometimes a more expensive option will be chosen because of convenience. Contractor A might have the lowest cost for construction, but contractor B has the next lowest, and they have expertise in LEED implementation. And then the build phase is actually building the thing. So that's all to say that the system of design, bid, build works best for the customer, Dakota State, when there are lots of qualified bidders. They'll have a broader selection of prices and services. But if there are only a handful of contractors willing to work on LEED certified projects, then costs go up, and they might need to hire additional people with expertise not found in the contractor. And that's a really valid problem, especially since the Board of Regents is trying to slim down its budget and eliminate unnecessary costs. That additional LEED premium seems like an easy target. But when I hear building green is expensive because people don't know how to do it, my response isn't to stop building green, it's to help people learn. Some ideas. The Association of General Contractors, which I mentioned earlier, can subsidize classes and costs of testing for its members to get LEEDs qualified. South Dakota can offer incentives for private entities like apartment and office buildings to become LEED certified so that there's more of a market for LEED qualified contractors. And of course, those all cost money. Everything does. But, I mean, first of all, sustainability and not destroying the earth is worth more than money. Secondly, with adequate support for LEED implementation, when you're not limited by scarcity of expertise, initial construction costs go down and energy and water efficiencies go up, improving the return on investment. At school, I learned that LEED does two things from the engineering perspective. It reduces energy costs, and it acts as good publicity. Even when I gave tours of the engineering school, I mentioned that our new academic building was the first academic building in New York City to be certified platinum more often than I didn't. In certain contexts, it's a selling point. A study in 2016 showed that there's a rental premium of about 9% for LEED apartments, compared to a little under 5% for properties with green features but no certification. So if an average apartment in City A cost $100 a month, I wish, the same apartment with green features but no certification would cost $105 a month, and that very same apartment with LEED certification would cost $109. So developers have an incentive, if only statistical, to get their multifamily units LEED certified. There are a few reasons certifications could be worth a premium. A prospective tenant could be interested in the cost savings on heating, AC, and water, or want the bike rooms, or the green space, or the improved air and light quality. They could value sustainability as a principle. They might also just like more unique buildings, since LEED certification often requires matching a project to its environment instead of using a cookie-cutter plan. Tenants in more rural areas might not have those same interests. As proponents of South Dakota Bill 134 constantly bring up during their testimonies, bikes aren't a particularly popular form of transportation in South Dakota. But I have my own issues with this statement, mostly that I rode a bike everywhere when I was there, and saw several people doing the same thing, and also that we're talking about college campuses where people are even more likely to use bikes. But I can't get into that now, or I'll just keep getting more annoyed. And, even one of the opponents of the bill, a lobbyist for the American Institute of Architects South Dakota chapter, said during his testimony that this isn't about green activism or environmentalism. Whether this anti-environmentalism is indicative of the entire state, I can't tell you, but it does seem like the legislators avoid making any mention of the sustainability benefits of LEED and other green building standards. There are also technical issues with certain practices encouraged by LEED. Things like solar water heaters weren't built for South Dakota winters. And it's not like there's a lot of guidance that I can find, at least on more rural LEED implementation. So not only does South Dakota seem to have a lack of green construction expertise, but they also don't have relevant design guides. Hint, hint, the several universities in the state and region that offer engineering degrees, this seems like a great field of research that you could pioneer. I think my biggest issue with this bill is that they just don't have any data to make a meaningful decision. The only numbers that I've been able to get my hands on are costs associated with LEED certification for certain university projects. But there's no breakdown of what those costs are, no indication of what level of certification those projects received. An energy engineer in Rapid City, Rick Bell, pointed out in his testimony that those costs could include practices that would be installed anyway, like energy monitoring or high-efficiency water fixtures, and wouldn't necessarily go away if certification requirements were lowered. And most critically, in my opinion, I have not been able to find anyone who can tell me what the energy savings for each of those projects are year to year. I do just want to touch on one number that the prime sponsor of the bill, State Senator Maher, has been referring to often. On that spreadsheet I showed earlier, there's this entry for the Chemistry and Bioengineering Center at the School of Mines. It says $481,200 was spent on LEED-associated costs, and there's a note that native grasses were installed and later removed because they looked like weeds. Just to get this out of the way, that's a weird reason. Like, did you ask anyone what they would look like? Did you hire a landscape architect with experience installing native landscapes? And why is looking like weeds a bad thing? What does that mean? And it's not a lawn, it's not that type of grass. It's wildlife habitat and stormwater treatment. Which, let's get into that. One of the credits in the LEED system is for protecting or restoring habitat. You can get points for restoring previously developed areas to habitat for native vegetation, plants indigenous to a specific region that have evolved to coexist with other life in those specific conditions. Today, with LEED 4.1, you need to cover at least 15% of the total site area, which includes the area the building occupies, with native vegetation. But LEED has changed over the years due to feedback from people who are actually implementing it, and around 2007, when the chem building at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology was being overhauled, version 2.2 was in effect. And back then, you had to cover 50% of the site area, not including the footprint of the building, with native vegetation. Okay, so we know that they installed native grasses at the chem building to fulfill a LEED requirement. Why is it even a requirement? First of all, native plants attract birds, bees, and other forms of biodiversity, which is important for the health of the soil. They're less prone to disease and should require less water and fertilizer than similar non-native species. Reduction of water use for irrigation is another point in the LEED system, and reducing fertilizer use helps keep waterways nutritionally balanced and healthy. When the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the branch of the USDA I worked for, recommends planting grasses, they usually recommend native grasses like western wheatgrass. Sometimes West River, it's more difficult to get seeds germinated before winter hits, so they recommend smooth brome grass, which is definitely invasive, but that's kind of a separate issue in agriculture and not as relevant here. Okay, so remember when I mentioned that number, $481,200? Again, that's the total amount of additional costs incurred because they had to pursue LEED certification. But 4 separate times in his testimony, Senator Maher has said that whole amount was spent on native grasses. But why do I even care about that? As an engineering student, I'm taught that numbers are everything. We make decisions based on the numbers. We might add contingencies or factors of safety to bump numbers up a little, but we always document that and we always explain our reasoning. We ask other people to check our calculations, to verify our results. It is the entire basis of our profession to solve problems using numbers. And, there are plenty of ways to manipulate numbers to tell the story you want to tell. You can only look at specific data sets and ignore others, or apply inappropriate analysis methods, or work with inherently biased samples. And those are all real problems that we have to address. But in cases like this, where you're claiming that there are savings to be had, you have to back that up with cold, hard numbers. There's no way around it. The whole reason this bill was pushed through so quickly is because the School of Mines is considering a new construction project. And according to early estimates, if they didn't have to achieve LEED Silver certification, they could save $1 million upfront. But as Senator Red Dawn Foster pointed out, that same project might achieve $10 million in energy savings, and without the historical data, there's no way to know if eliminating that requirement for LEED Silver certification is a good idea. Like I said earlier, the bill passed both houses and was signed into law. But this is just one bill in one state with a track record of conservative lawmaking. My point is that this could be happening elsewhere, especially in state and local legislatures where there can be a massive volume of bills to be considered at one time and not enough staff to thoroughly research and fact-check claims. Lawmakers are making these decisions without all the data they need. And this video took me over a month to research on top of my classes, and there are still more questions I have about this one specific bill. So I'm not saying everyone should start fact-checking every bill that's on the table in their jurisdiction, but maybe you could pick one topic or just one bill and try to understand what claims are being made. What would change? Why is this bill being considered now? What data has been presented and what data hasn't? I'm not gonna lie, if you're not already well-versed in legal or technical jargon, it can be a slog trying to find what the bill is really saying. But I'd suggest looking at any news coverage, even if it's a super biased opinion piece, to immerse yourself in the world of the bill for a little while. And then ask your questions. Pick up the phone and call someone if you think they could help you answer. A lot of legislators have constituent services in their offices to answer questions like yours. Hold your legislators accountable because you deserve to know what they're doing on your behalf. I'll see you next time.